read out part of a chapter that I've been writing in my book regarding economics. So this is a quick overview of some of the essentials of modern-day economics. G. Edward Griffin was probably the first to really give an in-depth history of how the Aldrich currency, the foundation of our present financial system, came about in his book A Creature from Jekyll Island, which I highly recommend. The book is not exactly integrally crafted, as it focuses on the right-hand structures almost exclusively, that is kind of objectivity and interobjectivity, but the book is genuinely brilliant nonetheless. And I quote, "The reason the Federal Reserve appears to be a complicated subject is because most discussions start somewhere in the middle. By the time we get into it, definitions have been scrambled, the basic concepts have been assumed. Under such conditions, intellectual chaos is inevitable. If we start at the beginning, however, and deal with each concept in sequence, from the general to the specific, and if we agree on definitions as we go, we shall find to our amazement that the issues are really quite simple." End quote. Griffin details the history of economics by mapping out not only where the Fed started, but where it is now and where it appears to be going in the future. He starts his book off with a journey to an island, and those that went there to set up a particular economic structure that is one of the major keys in regards to the happenings we see presently unfolding around us. Quote, "The elite group of financiers embarked on an 8-mile journey that led to Atlanta, then to Savannah, and finally to the small town of Brunswick, Georgia. They secretly," end quote, "they secretly boarded a train outbound from New Jersey, and some of the men were disguised as duck hunters and carrying rifles, suggesting that indeed they were on a duck hunting trip. This elite group contained only 7 members. In their travels, these men spoke to each other with first names only, so that the servants didn't know who they were. They left in the darkness and were headed hundreds of miles south. They were bound for Jekyll Island, Georgia. There these 7 men went in secrecy with but a few servants, most of which were changed to help maintain the secrecy of the identity of those men on the island. On this Eldridge train they were outbound for New Jersey on the dark night of 1910. There were almost certainly, quote, 7 men who represented an estimated 1/4 of the total wealth of the entire world." End quote. In 1916, about 6 years after the men met in secret, in Leslie's Weekly, a picture came out that showed some of the nation's greatest bankers leaving New York on a private rail car together. We are now exploring the contours of what they did after they left that dark night. These men were meeting in secret to find a way to collaborate or form a cartel to bring the Federal Reserve into partnership with the government. The federal government into partnership with these powerful banking interests, rather. In order to set up laws to enforce this cartel agreement, they needed to establish laws only the government could enforce. Interestingly, with most cartels, there's no method to force cooperation between the members of the cartel, other than threats of death and so forth. But if you bring the government into the game, then you can enforce rule following within the cartel by actually establishing laws that promote a sort of even-handedness within it. But to do this, they needed the cooperation of the government by creating actual laws throughout America. Quote, "In 1914, 1 year after the Federal Reserve Act was passed into law, Senator Eldridge could afford to be less guarded in his remarks. He boasted, 'Before the passage of this act, the New York bankers could only dominate the reserves of New York. Now we are able to dominate the reserves of the entire country, and soon the world,' unquote." No, not that last part, I just said that. Had it been known that these rivaling factions within the banking community actually joined together to establish laws that would enable their cartel to flourish, the public of the day would have been up in arms. G. Edward points out that there were 5 objectives these men were trying to put into practice, namely, stop or drastically slow the competition between the nation's newest banks, build a franchise to create money out of nothing and use this franchise for the purpose of lending. 3. Get the control of the reserves of all the banks so that the more reckless banks would not have the problems they once had with currency drains and bank runs. 4. Get the taxpayer to pick up the cartel's inevitable losses. And 5. Get the Congress on board with the idea that this whole Federal Reserve System was created to actually protect the public's interest. End quote. We will get into the logistics and reasoning as to why Griffin holds that these were in fact the real interests. In retroflection, we can note these were exactly the goals that were accomplished when the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law. Signed into law by the American government just a few days before Christmas, when but a few senators were present in 1913 when the law was passed. Maybe we'll stop there for this video and pick up in the next regarding a 7-step process in which ultra-rich became super ultra-rich. In other words, how the Federal Reserve System is functioning, arguably. Blessings.